Hi, I'm Jacob Hornberger, president of the Future of Freedom Foundation, and this is this week's issue of the Libertarian Angle, the show that the Future of Freedom Foundation brings you on a weekly basis that discusses the libertarian perspective on what's going on in the world. And I'm joined, as I am every week, by my co-host, Richard Ebeling, who teaches economics at the Citadel. Richard, welcome back. Good to see you again.
Good to see you and our viewers and listeners.
Yeah, likewise. Big news, North Korea, President Trump made a big brouhaha over that crisis, claiming that he is prepared to bring flame and fury to North Korea, which conjures up, of course, nuclear weaponry. Richard, here we are, another foreign interventionist crisis. I mean, it really amazes me is how the American people, or how any American, can still be an interventionist after we see this long, inglorious history of interventionism. I mean, if you look at Iraq or Vietnam, you and I have written a lot about the adverse consequences of World War I and World War II. We look at Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, now North Korea. I mean, it's really pathetic how Americans have to live their lives under constant crises, constant chaos that comes with this foreign policy of empire and interventionism. I mean, after Iraq and Afghanistan, the enormous amount of chaos and crisis and death and destruction that have come about through all these interventions, I just don't see how anybody can still be an interventionist. And I find it amusing in sort of a adverse way that President Trump, in the midst of this North Korea crisis, says that he's contemplating interventionism in Venezuela because of Maduro's dictatorship and socialism have caused so much death and misery and suffering in that country. I mean, does he not get the link here that the reason that any third world country, which clearly lacks the military potential to stand up to the United States, the reason they would want nuclear weapons is to deter a U.S. invasion, a U.S. regime change against their country. And that's in fact what North Korea has been doing for decades now, is trying to figure out some way to deter a U.S. regime change operation. And so here Trump comes along and effectively confirms that and says, well, we may just do a regime change operation in Venezuela. Well, that's why third world countries that are recalcitrant, that are independent of the U.S. empire, want nuclear weapons to deter that kind of invasion. And of course, we saw that many years ago with respect to Cuba, that when the U.S. was trying to effect regime change operations there with invasions, assassinations, and the like, they brought in nuclear missiles from the Soviet Union, which worked. They caused President Kennedy to say, okay, in return for our vow not to invade Cuba and effect a regime change operation there, you'll take your nuclear missiles out, and the Soviet Union did that. So I guess in sum, what I'm saying is that this is the way of life when you've got a foreign policy of interventionism, regime change, empire. It's constant crises, constant chaos, and that really, if Americans want to restore a normal kind of life, a life that's not filled with daily crises and chaos, the only solution to this is a restoration of a constitutionally limited republic, close all the military bases, including those in Korea, bring the troops home, and leave the world to work out its own problems without interference from the U.S. government. What do you think?
Well, I think that all of this stems from a certain political, philosophical, and ideological perspective that has dominated American foreign policy and foreign policy thinking since the end of the Second World War. And that is the idea that some great power must serve as the policeman of the world. The perception, the interpretive framework that has operated since 1945 is that you see America turned its back on Europe after the First World War, by not joining and participating in the League of Nations. And as a consequence of this, Europe fell into this mire of nationalistic conflict antagonism that finally imploded in the form of the Second World War with the rise of the Nazi regime and then the invasion of Poland. And as a consequence of this, America, realizing that it has a destiny, a duty, a responsibility, in the mindset of someone like FDR of the time, to bring a new deal to the world. And that therefore the United States, maybe in collaboration with other great powers, if it's doable, must bring order, stability, and direction to the global affairs to prevent a third world war. Now, that is the mindset that has guided policymakers, Democrat, Republican, liberal, and conservative, though they may have differed where to intervene, how to intervene, and when to intervene. But it has dominated the thinking and the perspective of all of them. It is what generated the first Korean War in 1950 through an erratic shift in U.S. policy that sent off different signals at the time in both North Korea and in Moscow. Then there was the Vietnam War. We have to prevent communist dominoes from falling in Southeast Asia. Then we get a humiliating withdrawal from Vietnam that sort of creates a receding of this attitude for a while. But then we start in all these other little petty interventions, finally leading up to the following the 9/11 events, which was partly instigated, besides their own fanaticism of Al-Qaeda, in the idea that the United States has military bases in the holiest of the holies of the Islamic world, which is viewed as an insult to their faith. And then when this tragedy occurs on 9/11, by these terrorists who commandeered the planes, then the United States invades Afghanistan, concludes that it has to remake that regime and bring order to it. And even before that has even been followed very far. And already it seems to be a task difficult to achieve because they couldn't even locate and track down bin Laden. Bush, with his neocon advisor, says it is time for America to bring order and democracy to the world by bringing down another tyrant in the form of Saddam Hussein, erroneously accused of having what? Weapons of mass destruction. And we get involved in that quagmire. And then, of course, we joined with the British and the French in particular to bring down Gaddafi in Libya and the fragmentation of Libya as a country into tribes and clans, with a disaster for the people living there on a day-to-day basis. So why don't they learn this lesson? How can this continue with, of course, the cost in taxes, material, and lives of Americans, even ignoring the innocents whose lives are lost or ruined? Okay, because Americans just are focusing on their own family and friend losses. It's because there is underlying this mentality since 1945, the attitude of the social engineer. Society, and in this case the global society, when left alone, will lead to nothing but chaos and disorder, conflict and destruction. There must be a guiding hand, a central planner, an organizer, an international regulator, if you will. And if not America, ooh, better us, even however imperfect we are, than them, who would be far, far worse. That is the mindset that dominates our foreign policy. And it's the reason that the false lessons are learned if there is a disaster in one of these interventions. Until that mindset is transformed into a limited government non-interventionist one, I don't see how these pathways of intervention in one place or another, where any president, Bush, Obama with his drone wars, and now Trump with his saber rattling in North Korea threats to Venezuela, how this policy set will ever disappear until the mindset guiding both domestic and foreign policy dramatically changes. This is a course from which there is no detour without an ideological and significant political shift.
Yeah, you make several fascinating points, among which is going back to the Roosevelt administration. I mean, that really was a watershed administration, because his New Deal prescription for America after the stock market crash in '29 really reflected this mindset that you're talking about, this central planning mindset that government can take care of people, that government can reorder American society, that government should do these things. I mean, this was the revolutionary change toward a welfare state, where the primary mission of the U.S. government became to take care of people. And there was that central planning mindset that saw the Great Depression as war, and that government can solve this by using with a military mindset. I mean, that's what the National Recovery Administration was all about, and the Agricultural Adjustment Act. But really, Richard, as you and I have pointed out, probably since the first edition of Future of Freedom, our monthly journal in 1990, I mean, the empire mindset goes back even further, at least as far back as the Spanish-American War in 1898, when the U.S. acquired the colonies that had previously been held by the Spanish Empire that they defeated. I mean, here this situation with Guam pops up in the context of this North Korean crisis, where the North Korean dictator says, "I'm going to unleash nuclear weaponry on Guam and on the U.S. facilities at Guam." Well, hardly anyone asks the fundamental question, well, what's Guam have to do with the United States? I mean, why does the United States own this island thousands of miles away? Well, the answer is the Spanish-American War, when there was this major turn toward empire that the U.S. government embarked upon. And then later, when Roosevelt's establishing his New Deal mindset in the United States domestically, gradually that turns into a central planning mindset for the world, as you point out. I mean, the United States government cannot settle for just reordering American society. It has to reorder and guide the world. And so you get this philosophy of interventionism and central planning, along with empire, that it stretched back at least to the Spanish-American War. And all of this comes to fruition in the post-World War II era. And as you pointed out, I mean, the blowback from all this interventionism has been horrendous. I mean, that's where we get the anti-American terrorism. The U.S. had been, when it lost its official Cold War enemy, the Soviet Union, which had been used to sustain this huge national security establishment, the Pentagon, the CIA, the NSA. They go in the Middle East in 90 and begin intervening in the Persian Gulf War, which was really none of their business, a war against their former ally, Saddam Hussein. Then they stationed troops near Mecca and Medina, as you pointed out, which are the holiest lands of the Muslim religion. They kill hundreds of thousands of Iraqi children with 10 or 11 years of brutal sanctions. And then they act surprised when there's this terrorist blowback. But they use, and that not just on 9/11, but before that with the terrorist attacks on the U.S. embassies in East Africa, the 1993 attack on the World Trade Center. And they're always saying that people who are engaged in these attacks, it's because of what your government is doing over here in the Middle East. And so, but then they use those terrorist attacks, including on 9/11, which are really just blowback for what they're already doing, as excuse to engage in more interventionism. So we get the invasion of Iraq, which is an absolute unmitigated disaster in terms of the massive death and destruction. You've got Afghanistan, Yemen, Syria, and as you point out of control federal spending and debt here. And then the loss of liberty here. I mean, we now live under a government that has tyrannical powers. There's no other way to put it. When you've got the power to assassinate your own citizens with impunity, to incarcerate your own citizens, torture them, that's the very essence of the powers that a tyrannical regime exercises. And it's all a result of this foreign policy of central planning, interventionism. I mean, to me, Richard, the ideal is really Switzerland. I mean, we wouldn't advocate a draft or anything like that, but Switzerland minds its own business. Their foreign policy is really the foreign policy of what the United States was founded on. They don't concern themselves with what's happening in Korea and the Civil War there, or Vietnam, or they certainly are not made the subject of terrorist blowback, because they're not doing what the U.S. empire is doing overseas. And you're right. I mean, what's needed in this country is not a change of leaders. People say, oh, if only we could get rid of Trump, all our problems would be solved. That's ridiculous. What really is needed is a structural change, a change that recognizes that, hey, the U.S. government shouldn't be intervening in the affairs of other nations. The U.S. government should be limited to just protecting the United States from an attack, which, of course, is a non-existent possibility at this point, given that no nation state has the military means to invade and conquer the United States. In other words, mind your own business.
Well, the difficulty with that is that there's always institutional inertia. And there are several institutional inertias at work here. One is the one that I first emphasized, the ideological mindset. We now have several generations of foreign policy experts, have several generations of professional members of the diplomatic corps. We have a vast network of employees of various types and focuses in government bureaucracies, the Department of State, the NSA, Homeland Security, the Defense Department. We can go down through all of them. You have this vast network of people who are in jobs that require them to be specialized in one thing, projecting American power around the world and devising policies to meet international crises that our presence inescapably draws us into, to which we then have to decide to respond. It's unimportant, we leave it alone. Oh, we think it's important, then we have to do something about it. But the world then is the playground of America deciding in which of the world's sandboxes requires American involvement right now, and which temporarily can be left to the children in that sandbox if they can sort it out themselves. But if not, then America, like the school teacher watching the kids during recess, may have to step in and set things right. There's also the fact is that there is this vast network of special interest groups whose own financial status and betterment is dependent upon the flow of government dollars. We take this for granted when it comes to domestic programs. Think of a company like Tesla, who gets a U.S. government subsidy to try to develop an electric car. Think of the companies that get subsidies to trying to develop a solar power. We all understand that they're attempting to cover costs that they could not cover if they had to rely upon just market revenue. We view this as the means and mechanisms of redistributive crony capitalism at home. What we need to appreciate is that the same feeding at the trough, the same lines of government financial dependency impacts about every company, larger, smaller, bigger government contracts, smaller government contracts, every company that services these foreign policy needs, from the ones who supply the military planes and the jeeps and the uniforms and the boots, the ammunition, to those who supply everything that these sectors demand, the computers, the surveillance technology, that these government agencies outsource for both supply and technological innovation. All of these companies are feeding at the trough of the redistributive crony capitalist interventionist state. They too have an immense stake in making sure that America stays present in the world and has enemies to have to ward off to justify these budgets. Now, it is true that if you look over the last 50 years, as a proportion of government spending, the defense budget is a lot less than it was a half a century ago. But we're still talking about a huge amount that if you talk about all the direct and indirect spending, we're talking about through the Defense Department, NSA, Homeland Security, et cetera, at least $1 trillion. Now, the last time I looked at my calculator, $1 trillion has a lot of zeros after that one. That is a huge amount of money of revenues and market share and profits that these companies are dependent upon for their livelihood. And as a consequence, the ideological, the employment, and the financial structure is such that until something dramatically changes, it will be very difficult to shift the spider web of foreign policy interventionist advocates.
Yeah, in fact, I think Eisenhower was making the exact same point you made when he delivered his farewell address, where he says, look, you've got this military-industrial, he started to call it the military-industrial congressional complex, because they're all intertwined. And they do it brilliantly. They have these military projects in every district across the land. They spread them out so that if any congressman says, look, we need to shut this thing down, out of control federal spending, debt, and so forth, boy, they go on the attack and say he's an ineffective congressman, and then the media says he's costing us our military base here in our district. He needs to be defeated. And so it's a very, very insidiously clever and cunning strategy. And of course the question arises is that once the military-industrial complex and the welfare state gets so many people on the dole, the welfare dole and the warfare dole, is it possible for people to turn things around? And that goes back to the power of ideas. Can ideas bring a shift in the course of a society? And both of us agree that they can. I think it's important to imagine what life would be like if the U.S. had not gotten involved in Korea. I mean, it was none of the government's business. There's no American who would have ever voluntarily gone to Korea to get involved in that civil war, which is really all it was, in order to save one side or the other. Americans would have said, well, it's tragic that there's a civil war going on. It's tragic that the communist side might win. At least some people believed that. But nobody would have given his life for it. And the U.S. intervenes and sacrifices tens of thousands of American men and does a complete carpet bomb devastation of the North, which they've never forgotten. I mean, it was a war against villages, towns, cities that flattened and killed untold numbers of people that they've never forgotten. And then you saw the repeat of that in Vietnam. Nobody would have gone to Vietnam. No American would have gone to give his life to preserve the South Vietnamese authoritarian, crooked, corrupt regime from a communist takeover. But the U.S. gets involved in this and wreaks untold damage and destruction. It's also unnecessary, Richard. If the U.S. had not gotten involved, who knows how the Korean Civil War would have worked out. Maybe the communists would have won like they did in Vietnam, but that's still none of the U.S. government's business. John Quincy Adams pointed this out in his famous 4th of July address in 1821. Look, a lot of bad things happen around the world. Despots, dictatorships, starvation, famine. But the U.S. government would not make it its mission to go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. Instead, the American people would establish a free society here at home as a model for the world, and by the way, as a sanctuary for people that wish to flee the tyranny of the oppression or the starvation, that they would have a place to come with open borders, open immigration, no questions asked. There's no reason why the American people have to live this life of constant crises, constant chaos, that if you did shift directions into the direction that you and I are calling for, Americans could live a life of peace and friendship and harmony with the people of the world.
Well, two aspects to this is that, you see, once you undertake such an interventionist foreign policy, your words and your deeds may very well create the circumstance that then forces you, given your foreign policy mindset, to militarily intervene somewhere. For instance, back in 1950, the Soviet archives that were partly opened in the 1990s, KGB, Soviet Ministry of Foreign Affairs from Stalin's own archives, shows that the North Korean dictator, Kim Il-sung, who the Soviets had put into power in 1945 after Korea was divided between the U.S. and the Soviet Union as occupation zones, had made several appeals in 1948, in 1949, to be allowed to invade South Korea. Stalin was very reluctant to do this. Mao was just consolidating power in China, having defeated Chiang Kai-shek. But then, in the early spring of 1950, Dean Acheson, the then Secretary of State, in a public address talked about America's security defense line. And Time magazine even had a map. And the line now included Japan and Taiwan, the retreat place of Chiang Kai-shek's nationalist Chinese army. But suddenly South Korea was left out of it. Acheson left out South Korea is part of America's defense zone. Following that, Kim Il-sung makes a new appeal to Stalin and Mao to allow him and to implicitly give their support for an invasion to unify all of Korea. And that set it off with Soviet material. And then the North Koreans invade, and actually practically wipe out the South Korean regime. But now the U.S. has gotten itself in a bind. It declares that it is the defender of the non-communist world in East Asia. It has made a public statement that says South Korea, even if it was by omission, is not part of it. The other side listens to it, and now the U.S. has to militarily intervene because of its own error by Dean Acheson. Now, fast forward. What about the first Gulf War, okay, against Saddam Hussein following his invasion of Kuwait? What was part of the signals of that? Saddam Hussein had the dispute with Kuwait about the digging in the oil fields along their border territory between Kuwait and Iraq, and slant drilling. And supposedly, the U.S. ambassador to either Kuwait or Iraq told Saddam Hussein's government that, we're not really interested in this. And Saddam Hussein took that as a signal. The U.S. will be indifferent if he invades Kuwait. Now, what did that force Bush Sr. to have to do? Well, America is the player, and there's Ayatollah Khamenei in Iran, and how will the Saudis view us? And suddenly now they have to liberate Kuwait. So once you get yourself into this bind of involvement in the world, your own missteps, your misspoken words, your thoughtlessness about what may happen if you do X instead of Y sucks you into the very types of military interventions that you presume your alliance and presence is meant to prevent. All of these are the unintended consequences. As long as these are going on, have that. Now, I just want to make one other comment, if I can, at amplifying something you had finished with in your last remarks. And that is America's feeling uncertain, under crisis. The problem is most Americans don't feel under crisis, Jake. Guam is far away. South Korea is far away. Kim Jong-un, the grandson of Kim Il-sung, actually bombing Alaska or nuking Hawaii or San Francisco, it doesn't touch them. It doesn't touch them. And the fact with the volunteer army, even if there was to be a ground war, would there be a loss and a tragedy for people, for the family members of American servicemen like in Afghanistan and Iraq? Yes. But compared to World War II, or the tens of thousands of lives lost in Korea and Vietnam, it doesn't hardly touch anybody. So in fact, the dilemma is that America plays this role of global empire policeman. It costs Americans tax money, and their sons and daughters are put in harm's way, and some of them tragically have these terrible things happen to them. But for the average American, I'm looking out the window of the house I'm in, okay? It doesn't touch them. It's just the headlines in the newspapers or words spoken when they catch part of the evening news. It's the fact that this can be undertaken, and it seems to have no positive or negative effect on the average American's lives, that makes it easier for the people in Washington to go about with business as usual.
Yeah, your point is well taken about how the U.S. embroils itself in a crisis and then uses that embroilment as the excuse to say, well, we now have to stay here or intervene here because of the crisis which their presence has generated. And the classic example is as Korea. I mean, when the armistice or the suspension of hostilities took place in the early 50s, the U.S. could have brought those troops home. I mean, they've been there for, what, 70 years or so? And what was the reason for those troops being stationed there? To serve as a sacrificial tripwire, that if the Civil War ever broke out again, U.S. troops would be killed, and therefore you would automatically have the U.S. embroiled in the conflict without having to go to Congress and get a declaration of war and follow the procedures that would be followed if there were no U.S. troops there at all. And so, yeah, and in a sense, you're right, Richard, that as long as, I think what's gotten people's attention is the possibility that this guy, Kim Jong-un, might have a nuclear missile in 5 years from now that can reach the United States. And all of a sudden, everybody perks up. I also think it's interesting that, I didn't realize this before, there's some 150,000 or 130,000 Americans living in South Korea. And so if Trump plans to initiate a war there, like with a so-called pinprick strike against the nuclear making facilities there, he has to decide whether to evacuate those Americans first. And of course, if he starts evacuating Americans from Seoul and the rest of South Korea, that's a signal that something's going to come, and which would motivate the North to possibly begin a preemptive strike.
Right.
My hunch is that Trump would say, well, let's just take our chances. If Americans die, that's just the breaks of it, because that's been their mindset with respect to U.S. troops there. Everybody knows there's going to be a certain number of U.S. troops that are killed if war breaks out, and that's the very purpose of having the troops there, to ensure U.S. involvement. I mean, all of this is just morally bankrupt, Richard. I mean, if you just brought the troops home, and then again, they use the presence of the troops, as the way to make the crisis bigger. I mean, North Korea says, well, the troops are here, they're engaged in exercises, military exercises for a regime change operation, and that's what they're fearing, that's why they need the weapons. And then Trump says, well, the fact that you're trying to get nuclear weapons is the reason why we need to be here and possibly start a war. And it's all because of that U.S. presence and intervention. If they had just brought the troops home, which is what they should do now, that's the solution. You don't need to talk to anybody. Just bring the troops home. The probability is that North and South, over time, being all Koreans, would figure out a solution to their own problem. But even if that solution ultimately involves the resumption of a civil war, the U.S. needs to stay out of it and leave Korea to the Koreans.
That is the foreign policy the U.S. should follow. Now, let me sort of add something here, which I've written about a few times, somewhat perhaps controversially, where I've talked about the privatization of foreign policy, by which I mean, if people believe, private American citizens believe, that there is some conflict or tragedy or tyranny going on in another part of the world, some people being unjustly aggressed against, even by another country, it should be the right and freedom of that American to freely go and give their money, humanitarian charity, to go over there to serve like Doctors Without Borders do, or even to volunteer to militarily participate themselves, putting themselves in harm's way of their own private choice, because they believe that the cause that is being fought over there, the oppression being opposed, the invasion being resisted, justifies by them as an act of conscience and political philosophy, perhaps, to go and fight there. The most famous example of this over the last 100 years, modern history, was the Spanish Civil War. The fact is, you had a fascist revolt led by Francisco Franco against a left-of-center government in Madrid in July of 1936. Then Franco did get military support from both Mussolini in fascist Italy and from Hitler from Nazi Germany. But the U.S. was neutral. And what happened for those people on the political left? Okay, there were socialists, there were even some American communists, just some American in the New Deal sense liberals, who believed that fascism needed to be stopped. And they, as volunteers in the thousands, went to Spain and fought on what was called the Republican side against what was called Franco's nationalist side. They were combined into what was called the Abraham Lincoln and the George Washington brigades. They fought, some died, some lived through the Civil War that finally ended 3 years later in July of 1939, before the Second World War began in Europe. That was the example of doing this. There's many instances where American professional soldiers have sold their services, either just out of a source of making money, as well as an ideological commitment. In the 19th century, American officers did this in China several times, offering their services to put down rebellions in the service of the Chinese government, because they had military expertise. Retired British officers have often served as advisors or in more direct military roles for governments in the Middle East in the post-war period. So all of these are the avenues that give an individual an opportunity to serve the cause that they believe in, without drawing in, like a vortex, every American who may or may not agree with them in terms of taxes raised, resources squandered, and American lives lost. Just as we expect in domestic policy in a free society, if you believe that there's a good and just and charitable cause deserving of your support, you are free to do so yourself. You are free to persuade and attract others to join associations to advance these charitable and related causes. But it is unjust for you to turn to the state to make others give either their fortunes or their lives for the causes that you share. Now, one example of this more recently, again, to just, without belaboring this too much, but it does cover the situation. Many people have pointed out the number of Western European Muslims in France, Italy, Britain, who attracted by the Islamic State and its ideology, have gone to the Middle East and ended up fighting, including non-Arab citizens of these countries, in other words, Anglo-Saxon Brits, French-born Frenchmen who have converted to Islam. They went and fought with Islamic State, fighting at the front line. Oh, how terrible. What has been downplayed, and admittedly in fewer numbers, the number of Americans and Western Europeans who went to fight in the Syrian civil war, but not on the side of the Islamic State, but with the Kurds, precisely because they believed the Islamic State was a threat to peace, to freedom of religious tolerance, and they voluntarily have gone to fight with the Kurds against Islamic State. Each of these have chosen the side that they thought was right. It in principle would not involve the governments of those people to get embroiled in this. It's the governments who have chosen to do that. That is how individuals show the degree to which they believe passionately that there's a cause abroad worth participating and even fighting for.
Yeah, and it's taking responsibility for your own beliefs and your own philosophy rather than embroiling the entire country by getting the government involved.
Right.
So, Richard, on that fine note, we have to wrap it up. We're out of time. If you'd like more information about Richard's and my perspective, come to our website at fff.org. Subscribe to our free daily email called FFF Daily, which we consider the best editorial or op-ed page from a libertarian perspective on the internet. And there on our website, we also have all the old issues of Libertarian Angle. Richard, greatly enjoyed the show, and I'll see you next week.
Till next time. Bye-bye.